Thank you so much. How great is it to be back here at SAGES in person? This is really fantastic, and thank you so much for putting together this session and the opportunity to speak. Today, what I'm going to do is give you a very quick overview of artificial intelligence, or AI. I'm going to talk about what AI is, discuss some basic concepts, and why AI is gaining traction in healthcare today. I'll also touch on what types of research or scientific evidence are needed to allow AI to be adopted safely and effectively in healthcare settings. So before I get started, I'll address my conflicts of interest. I am now an executive at Intuitive Surgical in a scientific strategy role, and my compensation involves salary, stock, and stock options. I was earlier this year a chief science officer and chief health officer at IBM Watson Health, and so I still own stock in IBM and Kyndryl. And I practice surgery part-time at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where I'm paid to do surgery. So I'm not planning to discuss any of the products or services of the companies that I have worked for in the last year or the services that I provide at Vanderbilt, but if I do, I will try to support what I say with scientific evidence. So let's start with what is AI? Well, artificial intelligence, very simply, is a term that is used to describe intelligence that is demonstrated by machines or computer programs that mimic human intelligence. I will only touch today on the computer science techniques that are used to create modern AI systems, but for the scope of this talk, but the key functionalities that characterize advanced AI systems are the ability to understand, to reason, to interact, sometimes in human-like ways using conversational technologies in voice or text, and the ability to learn, programs that can learn and improve their performance over time. Now, most contemporary artificial intelligence programs use a computational technique called machine learning, which involves algorithms or programs that can perform a task without explicit instructions from a programmer. So old-fashioned or early computer science programs followed exactly the code that was written by a programmer, but machine learning algorithms build mathematical and statistical models, and they build those models based on patterns that they find in the data that they process. And then they use those models to do things like classify things, such as identifying structures in surgical videos or radiographic images, or to make predictions, like predicting one's risk for a complication after surgery. And although it sounds quite complicated, you can think about machine learning in a very simple way. The computer is taking inputs, like the data from a digital image of a skin mole, and then generating an output, such as a category, benign or malignant, or a probability, such as the likelihood that a lesion is malignant. And there are two main types of learning, supervised and unsupervised. In supervised learning, an algorithm learns from a training set, or a set of data that is annotated in input and output pairs. For example, you could take images or videos from cholecystectomy and label some as having an adequate critical view of safety and some as not. And then the algorithm would learn a function that could map from that input to the output. In unsupervised learning, the algorithm actually discovers categories from the input data. And the most common form of unsupervised learning is something called clustering, which will identify groups of the input examples that share some commonalities. And my favorite example from this is actually an analysis that was done on patterns of patient portal messages, so patient-provider messaging, and it identified patterns such as appointment preppers and lab checkers and hover moms. So you may have heard the term deep learning. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning techniques in which the mapping of input to output occurs in multiple steps or multiple layers. And with each layer, progressively, higher level features or abstractions are generated from the raw data to progressively identify the ultimate output. And deep learning methods are often called neural networks, as they were inspired by the complex network of neurons that you see in biological systems. Now, a really common misconception is that AI is a new or emerging technology, and it's absolutely not. So artificial intelligence was established as an academic discipline in computer science in the 1950s. And when I started my career in biomedical informatics, which was about 30 years ago, I wanted to do AI research, but I'm a pragmatic surgeon type, and I really felt like the world wasn't ready for AI to have an impact. And now there's a ton of hype around AI. And so what's different? Well, in the early 1990s, there wasn't much healthcare data that was available online. People didn't use EHRs or computerized systems, and when they did, they had really small siloed data sets. And since then, as we all know, there have been advances in the technologies to store data and increased adoption of electronic health records, PACS systems, and a whole bunch of other health information technologies, so we actually have the opposite problems. There's growing and complex data set, and 80% of data in healthcare is completely unstructured. So again, early in the days of AI, data sets were stored separately, often using different hardware and software, and they didn't talk to each other. And now we have technologies that can share data and process it securely, like hybrid cloud and blockchain. And finally, over the last decades, we've seen both advances in hardware and computational techniques, like deep learning and quantum computing, that actually give us that computational power and the tools that we need to analyze and utilize complex data sets. So now really is that time for AI to take off in healthcare. It is also the case that artificial intelligence technologies already exist and are already used by all of the stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem. So there are tools like for healthcare providers like ourselves that provide clinical decision support. They can do things like predict one's risk of suicide in an emergency department encounter. There are tools for healthcare payers that can detect fraud in claims databases. Tools for people who purchase healthcare, like those little chatbots you might have used to select your health benefits plan during open enrollment. There are tools for policymakers that can predict the effectiveness of a particular initiative, like wearing masks. And there are tools for life sciences companies that can help accelerate targets for drug development or to optimize clinical trial design. And there are even tools for patients that can take in their data and diet and activity and help them manage their chronic diseases. So, with all that, many of you are probably still a little bit skeptical of such tools. And a big question is, if they're being introduced into your practice, or your patients are coming and say, I have this great little app that I'm using to manage my disease, you might ask, do they work? And that's actually a really good question, because when things like drugs and devices are introduced into practice, there are sometimes multiple studies that are reviewed and approved by the FDA. Whereas for a lot of AI, especially that developed at academic medical centers where they're in marketing claims, or those that are used to assist clinicians rather than replace them, they are not regulated. So I think it is really important for those of us who develop AI systems to do the scientific studies that show that they're safe and effective. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what that science should look like. This slide shows a very simple framework for the evaluation of any health information technology, including AI tools. And you really need to do, very simply, three things. You need to show that the tools technically work, that they can be used by their intended users in a healthcare setting, and that they have an impact. So that first step is showing that the algorithms technically perform well, predicting risk or classifying things accurately. And although that sounds really scary, the evaluation of a natural language processing or a machine learning algorithm is very similar to the evaluation of a diagnostic test. And you measure the performance in things like sensitivity, specificity, area under the curve. When we know tools technically do what they're supposed to do, you need to put them in the hands of a real clinical user and make sure they can use them to accomplish the tasks they're intended to accomplish in a real healthcare workflow. And finally, we ultimately want to show that AI tools have an impact, such as saving lives, reducing costs, reducing recurrence. When AI tools are first introduced, you often are going to look at those proximal or process incomes, such as do clinical decision support tools change decisions? And it is only with time that you can look at the longer-term outcomes, such as a survival, a recurrence, or reduction of cost. Now, evaluation should be done systematically. to avoid confounders. This is basic science. So when AI tools are first introduced, it's us clinicians who are the ones that are often saying, you know, I'm really not going to believe this until I see a randomized controlled trial that shows that it reduces recurrence. And while randomized controlled trials are certainly a long-term evaluation goal, if you do not know that your tool works technically and you have not evaluated its usability in a real clinical workflow, you are setting yourself up to fail. And I will also say, and many of you have probably had experience with this, when you introduce a new technology, you have no idea what that effect size is going to be. So you need to do those preliminary studies to understand that. Repetition is also really important whenever something changes in the way that you're using an AI tool. So a natural language processing tool that works really well in a primary care setting may not work when you throw it at the notes that are written by trauma surgeons or rheumatologists. And this process needs to be repeated whenever conditions change, especially if you have algorithms that are learning and changing their performance over time. Now, this sequential approach really isn't different than what you know about research for drugs and medical devices, although there are a couple of important differences. So you can think about that preclinical phase as your algorithm development and prototyping your tool. And here you're doing sort of proof of concept technical performance. In your phase 1, testing for safety and efficacy, you want to evaluate your algorithm on a very robust data set, something that's reflective of what it will be used in, and do usability testing on your prototypes. In phase 2, you want to put your tools in real clinical workflows to see what the users do with them and evaluate for performance, usability, and then integration into that workflow setting. And here you can estimate your effect size, which will lead you to your phase 3 definitive randomized control trial to evaluate impact. AI tools, like anything else, need monitoring for performance, which can change based on a large number of factors, changes in the underlying data, changes in your target population, or an algorithm learning over time. So I hope this framework gives you an idea of the types of science that you should be looking for at meetings like this when you're seeing evaluations of AI solutions. So since scientific strategy for AI tools has been my job for almost 4 years, I'm going to give you a few tips. First, real clinicians should be involved in AI evaluations in healthcare to set thresholds for performance. So if you are evaluating an AI tool that automatically interprets a radiographic image, the consequences for missing something like a lung lesion are really high. So that false negative is really important, and you need a clinician to tell you that this is a really, this is a tool where we really need to avoid those false negatives or false positives, depending on the context. Now, when you think about how AI tools should perform, knowing and establishing that baseline performance that you're trying to improve is super important. So in the 70s and 80s, when people were developing the first diagnostic AI systems, knowledge-based systems or expert systems for medicine, people would arbitrarily choose a threshold. And they'd say, like, yeah, if we're doing diagnosis, it should be about 90, 95% accurate. And when they actually went back and looked at what the doctors were doing in practice, they weren't that accurate, or they weren't that consistent. And so you need to know that baseline of which you are trying to improve, to have reasonable expectations about what your performance should be. Now, if your AI tool is intended to be used by a human being, you need to expect the unexpected. So AI algorithms differ significantly from drugs and devices, which tend to function in a relatively predictable manner. But if you are giving the output of your AI system to a human being, they need to understand it, they need to trust it, they need to contextualize it, and then they need to be motivated to take an action on that output. And so, whereas, again, drugs and devices perform in a relatively predictable manner, humans do not. And there are a lot of steps between the output and the action. And I would say look for challenges in interpreting the results of an AI algorithm, mistrust, or creative new uses for the information, or even unintended consequences. Finally, when you get to, when you get to that comparative trial, it's also important to choose the right comparator. So if you are evaluating an AI tool that is intended to be used to assist a clinician rather than to replace that clinician. Although people love the drama of human versus machine, I worked at IBM, we're partially responsible for that, for the Jeopardy thing, your appropriate comparison is the human with and without the tool. And finally, and I think most importantly, don't skip steps. So plan your evaluation systematically to include technical performance, usability, workflow, and then impact. Many of the failures that you have seen of AI systems in clinical settings are those who have skipped steps in their development and their evaluation. So this talk has been a very quick tour through some of the basic concepts of AI, some of the reasons AI is gaining traction in healthcare, and hopefully for this scientific meeting, an overview of the types of scientific evidence that you should be looking for in AI systems. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak, and I'll be happy to take any questions either now or later. Okay, perfect.